At 21:17 local time, on an April night in 2026, a Russian locomotive engineer guides 14 cars of diesel fuel and artillery ammunition through occupied Crimea at 50 kilometers per hour. He sips coffee from a thermos, watching the dark rail corridor unfold beyond his windshield. 35 kilometers away, Ukrainian operators from Huer's Primiti special unit monitor his engine's glowing thermal signature through encrypted Starlink connections. In precisely 40 seconds, this locomotive will become their 5th confirmed kill in a relentless campaign that has been strangling every Russian supply line into Crimea for months. Right now, he has no idea they are watching. But this operation didn't begin tonight. It started weeks earlier, when the Ghosts initiated a series of actions that would make everything else possible. They began systematically destroying radars. Somewhere in occupied Crimea in late February, a 48 Yi-61 Podlet radar station was scanning low-altitude airspace. This is Russia's frontline detection system for cruise missiles and drones, designed to spot targets flying below conventional radar coverage. Precisely the flight profile Ukrainian strike drones use to approach their objectives. Its operators were watching clean scopes. The airspace appeared quiet. Then, a Primiti drone, launched from a position the operators would never identify, descended through the detection floor and impacted the antenna array. Thermal camera footage, later released by Shure, showed the radar installation erupting in a brilliant white flash. The scope went dark. A 50-kilometer detection bubble over southern Crimea had just vanished. 3 days later, the Ghosts struck a Kasta 2E2 radar 80 kilometers to the east. This system monitors airspace and identifies aircraft at extremely low altitudes, feeding crucial tracking data to Panzer and Tor air defense batteries. Without the Kasta, those batteries are effectively shooting blind, about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. Next, a Sopka coastal surveillance radar was hit. Then, the 96L6 radar, which feeds targeting data directly to the S-400 Triumph system. The S-400 is Russia's crown jewel of air defense, capable of engaging targets at 400 kilometers. Without its 96L6 feed, the missiles lack a guidance solution. 2 million interceptors with nowhere to go. The Ghosts weren't being subtle. Throughout March and into April, they launched strike after strike. Serval command and control vehicles that coordinate air defense across entire sectors. Electronic warfare stations jamming Ukrainian drone frequencies, relay nodes supporting Geran and Gerbera-type loitering munitions, and even a component of Russia's GLONASS satellite navigation system. Open-source analysts would later count nearly 80 Ukrainian strikes against Russian air defense systems in March and April alone, a staggering 300% increase over the previous period. Crimea accounted for 100 out of 173 confirmed strikes. Each destroyed radar opened a corridor. Each dead EW station removed a layer of jamming. Each wrecked command vehicle severed coordination between batteries, which were now operating isolated, confused, and increasingly blind. The Ghosts weren't randomly hitting targets. They were meticulously carving lanes through Russia's sensor network, like a surgeon cutting paths through tissue. Lanes that drones would soon fly through. Lanes that led directly to Russia's rail lines. On the night of April 6th in the Kerch Strait, the Slavian railway ferry was making its crossing from Russia's Taman Peninsula towards Crimea. Its cargo holds were loaded with fuel, lubricants, weapons, ammunition, and military equipment. This was the last railway ferry operating in the strait. Russia had stopped running military cargo across the Kerch Bridge rail section months ago, after repeated SBU strikes turned the crossing into a liability. The Slavian was the final lifeline. Her drones struck it. The ferry had already been hit once in March, but remained afloat. This time it did not survive. The vessel was permanently put out of service. Every ton of military supply entering Crimea now flowed through one route, a single overland railway running from Rostov-on-Don through occupied Mariupol and Berdyansk to Dzonkoy in northern Crimea. Russia built this line specifically because they could no longer trust the Kerch Bridge. Putin himself announced it at a concert celebrating the annexation of Crimea, declaring, "This work will continue, and soon trains will run directly to Sevastopol, providing another alternative route to Krimskoy for the Crimean Bridge." A bold move, announcing your only remaining supply line on national television. The Ghosts now knew exactly where to look. Mid-April, approximately 02 hours. Primary reconnaissance drones had been loitering over Crimean rail corridors for hours. These were modified platforms with extended flight endurance and digital zoom pushed to 56 times magnification. Their thermal feeds revealed everything: rail junctions, switching stations, the heat signatures of idling locomotives waiting for clearance, and moving trains. The first target materialized on the operator's screen, a Russian freight train moving southeast through the Crimean interior. The locomotive's diesel engine registered 47 degrees Celsius on thermal, glowing white against the cool night landscape. Behind it, tanker cars showed temperature variations consistent with liquid fuel. Military flat cars carried shapes matching ammunition crates and vehicle components. Each tanker held 60 to 70 metric tons of diesel. 12 cars meant roughly 840 metric tons, enough to keep 3 Russian armored battalions operational for 10 days. The strike drone was already airborne. It carried a shaped charge warhead, a copper-lined cone that focuses explosive energy into a penetrating jet, traveling at thousands of meters per second. The drone descended to low altitude and entered one of the corridors the Ghosts had carved through Russia's radar network over the past 6 weeks. Where a podlet would have detected it at 50 kilometers and vectored a Panzer battery to intercept, there was silence. Where a Costa 2E2 would have fed tracking data to a Tor M2 launcher, there was only a burned-out antenna housing and nothing else. The drone closed on the locomotive. At 50 kilometers per hour, the target covered nearly 14 meters every second. The operator calculated closure rate, crosswind, and approach angle. He had one shot. Miss by 3 meters and you hit empty framing. Miss by 10 and you crater gravel while 840 metric tons of Russian supplies rolled on into the Crimean night. He didn't miss. The shaped charge detonated against the engine housing. The copper jet liquefied steel at 2,800 degrees Celsius, punching through the engine block and igniting diesel in the fuel reservoir. The locomotive shuddered, lost power, and began trailing fire and thick black smoke. 14 cars of military cargo ground to a halt on tracks that suddenly led nowhere. Strike one. Hours later, along a different rail corridor, the Russians were now alert. The first strike had triggered heightened security across Crimean rail lines. Armed patrols were riding flat cars. Someone in the Russian command structure had figured out that drones were hunting their trains. Congratulations. It only took one exploding locomotive. The Ghosts didn't care. Their second target was a fuel tanker car. Specifically, not the locomotive this time. They wanted this fuel to burn. The approach was identical: thermal reconnaissance, encrypted satellite data link, low-altitude ingress through a dead radar corridor. Russian soldiers on the flat cars were scanning the sky with their eyes and AK-74s, looking for something they could hear. At altitude, the strike drone produced barely a whisper above the noise of a moving freight train. They would never hear it coming. The shaped charge impacted the tanker's sidewall. At 2,800 degrees, the copper jet didn't just penetrate. It vaporized a hole through 15 millimeters of steel and hit 60 metric tons of diesel on the other side. The fuel didn't leak, it erupted. A fireball bloomed across the thermal camera, whiting out the feed for a full second before the operator adjusted the gain. The temperature inside the car exceeded 4,000 degrees Celsius within seconds. Adjacent cars began heating. The interconnected ventilation systems between fuel cars, designed for pressure equalization during loading, became a highway for destruction. Within 20 seconds, burning vapors had ignited the cars on either side. Strike 2, and the fire was still growing. The third, fourth, and fifth strikes unfolded across April. Different corridors, different nights, each one targeting locomotives or fuel tankers on moving freight trains. The Ghosts rotated through attack routes, varied timing, and never hit the same corridor twice in a row. Russian logistics planners were now treating every train movement through Crimea as a potential death sentence. Some trains ran with reduced loads, some ran at night with no lights. None of it mattered when the enemy was watching through thermal cameras that read engine temperature from 35 kilometers away. During one of the later strikes, the drone was on its terminal approach when something changed. A Russian soldier on the ground had spotted it. He shouldered a MANPADS, a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile aimed at the incoming drone, and fired. The missile streaked upward, its infrared seeker locking onto the thermal signature of the drone's electric motors. The primary operator saw it happening in real time on his feed, a missile climbing toward his aircraft. He threw the drone into evasive maneuvers, sharp turns that forced the seeker to recalculate its intercept solution. The MANPADS was designed for faster, hotter targets, helicopters, low-flying jets. The drone's thermal footprint was tiny by comparison. The seeker struggled to maintain lock through the erratic movement. The missile passed behind the drone and detonated harmlessly, and the operator, the absolute madman, turned the drone back toward the train. He reacquired the target, lined up the approach, and completed the strike. A surface-to-air missile just missed his aircraft, and his response was to keep going. That's not standard operating procedure. That's a personality trait. But the ghosts weren't limiting themselves to rail corridors. While the train strikes were rolling through April, Prometi launched a simultaneous campaign against everything Russia had floating, flying, or standing in Crimea. On the night of April 18th to 19th, in Sevastopol Bay, the targets were two of Russia's largest remaining landing ships moored in the harbor, the Project 775 Yamal 112, 5 meters long, built in 1988, with a cargo capacity of 500 metric tons including armored vehicles and troops, estimated value over $80 million. And the Project 1171 Nikolai Filchenkov, built in 1975, with a cargo capacity over 1,000 metric tons, estimated value over $70 million. Combined $150 million of Russian naval logistics capability sat in Sevastopol Bay like floating warehouses. Prometi drones crossed the harbor. The same air defense network that should have detected them at range had been systematically shredded over the past 2 months. The drones struck both ships. The Yamal and the Filchenkov were left completely inoperable. In the same operation, the Ghosts put a Podlet K-1 radar station, worth approximately $5 million, into the ground. 3 targets one night, $155 million in damage, and they still weren't done. Days later, a B-12 Cheka amphibious aircraft, one of fewer than 20 still operational in the entire Russian military, took a drone strike on an airfield in Crimea. 3 Project 5060 assault boats, compact high-speed vessels designed to carry 10 troops at 40 knots for rapid landing operations, were destroyed alongside a support vessel and a hangar storing more assault boats. The Ghosts hit a communication and power supply station for a Gran UAV repeater, an MR-23 Thorn-Vagich coastal radar, and more Serval command and control systems. They even struck a fuel reservoir at an AAN company oil depot, hitting the supply chain that feeds Russian vehicles across the peninsula. On May 5th in Armyansk, northern Crimea, drones hit a Russian FSB border guard facility. The Crimean Wind Telegram channel reported the aftermath. Half the FSB building was completely gone. Not damaged, not partially collapsed. Gone. On May 6th, Ur released the footage. The thermal video showed it all, locomotives burning in the Crimean darkness. Fuel tankers erupting in white-hot fireballs that bloomed across the screen like flowers made of superheated diesel. Rail infrastructure warping under thermal stress. 5 precision strikes on moving trains. Everyone delivered through corridors that the same you'd spent months carving through Russia's air defense network. Podlets were killed to open the lanes. Castas were destroyed to blind the batteries. S-400 radars were wrecked to ensure no interceptor could touch the strike drones as they descended on locomotives, hauling the fuel and ammunition that Russia's southern front depends on to keep fighting. The economics tell the final story. Each strike drone costs somewhere between $5,000 and $20,000. A single Russian locomotive costs over $2 million. A loaded fuel train represents tens of millions. The Slavian Ferry, the Yamal and Filchenkov landing ships, the B-12 aircraft, the radar stations, the FSB building, the assault boats, the fuel depot. Someone in Moscow is looking at the April damage report right now and seriously considering a career change. So here's the question. Ghosts blinded Russia's radars, sank their ships, burned their trains, destroyed their aircraft, leveled an FSB building, and evaded a Manpad's launch. All in a single month, with drones operating through encrypted Starlink in territory Russia has occupied for over a decade. What happens when Ukraine gets more of them? Drop your answer in the comments.